So friends, it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our final keynote speaker in the first annual Palmer Theological Seminary Science and Religion Symposium. Dr. Melanie Harris is a professor of Black feminist thought and womanist theology, jointly appointed with Wake Forest School of Divinity and the African American Studies program at Wake Forest University. Dr. Harris is also the director of the Food, Health, and Ecological WellBeing Program. A graduate of the Harvard Leadership Program, Dr. Harris is a former American Council of Education Fellow and founding director of the TCU African American and Africana Studies Program. Her research and scholarship critically examines intersections between race, religion, gender, and environmental ethics. She's the author of many scholarly articles and books, including Gifts of Virtue, Alice Walker and Womanist Ethics, and Ecowomanism, Earth-Honoring Faiths, which some of you seminarians may have read this year, and co-editor of Faith, Feminism, and Scholarship, The Next Generation, as well as numerous journal articles and book chapters. Please help me welcome Dr. Melanie Harris.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Zach Jackson. What a gift. My goodness. I am so grateful to you and to Palmer Seminary of Eastern University. My goodness, what a gift of environmental justice that is flowing through this symposium today. And wonderful gifts of wisdom yesterday as well. I feel as if I am with you, and I am so grateful to you that I can be with you in this way, at least, during this particular moment in our time. So grateful to each of the administrators who have been there and working on this powerful symposium in this amazing time. It's amazing to be a leader in higher education and theological education, particularly in this era, this COVID pandemic. So I thank you for your work and your commitment to education. I thank you so much for your work and your commitment to the students, the faculty and staff at Palmer. I am overjoyed to be with you and to have heard so much wisdom from the panelists yesterday and today, and deeply, deeply grateful for the wisdom of both activists and scholars and scientists. The marriage between science and religion is one that runs deep. And it's very, very important to be able to chart our own path and our own theology with the voices of so many who have done so much valuable work before us, and certainly to create spaces and paths for those who will be coming even after us. And I do say after us with hope indeed, that the same seeds that we are planting of hope and resilience that we've been uttering even on today will be picked up by so many young students and young scholars, young scientists, and theologians continually working on climate justice. I am so grateful to be joining you from North Carolina, and here I do serve at Wake Forest University and Wake Forest School of Divinity. We are excited to be really in this particular moment in time, certainly working on ecological justice from this space, and also near and dear to our own heart is the gift of being able to share knowledge and share wisdom in as many educational contexts as possible. And so I share with you the joy of spreading the good news of environmental justice through this new approach of ecowomanism. I'll begin again by thanking you, and especially thanking our technical team. David has been wonderful in allowing us to practice. And now, as we move forward, I want to invite you to center yourselves by taking a look indeed at the screen and allow the presentation to be both ministry to your soul and also food for your own intellect. Let's begin with the next screen that allows us to go into first a contemplative moment of meditation with one another. You're invited to come into a centered place of soul and being, whatever that means for you. That may mean a position of prayer. It may mean a stance of meditation. It may be a grounding with the earth. However is easy for you to be. I invite you now to be in that moment. Breathing in very deeply the gift of air, recognizing the power of breath, ruach, that goes throughout your own being. You're invited to breathe in and to exhale. Breathing in very deeply, allowing yourself to be reminded of the gift of breath. Exhale, recognizing that you too are an earthling. And a final third breath, breathing in very deeply. Allow your soul and your spirit and mind just to settle. And exhale when you're ready. You are deeply rooted in the earth. Her amazing grace flows through you. Her divine breath breathes through you. As wide as rivers run and as far as oceans go, you are deeply one with earth community. You are rooted in the earth, and earth is rooted in you. The gift of Ecowomanism opens us to a new way, a contemplative way, but also an intellectually stimulating way of getting into the frames that help us flow into environmental justice. The work, of course, that we've heard already in this wonderful symposium carries through the voices of theology and theologians, particularly mapped on by the beauty, the arcs, and the challenges of Christian theology. And also the gift of science in the very nuanced ways, in the multiple fields, in the ways that it shows up not only historically, but also the ways that it shows up even in this day and time. What you see before you is an image of the cover of the book, Ecowomanism. It's an image called Healing Grace by Charles Bibbs, a wonderful African-American artist out of Chicago, who does remarkable work in terms of helping art to release the soul into full expression. Here we do see this combination of flow and movement, spirit and earth. One of the things I love and value so deeply about Charles Bibbs' work is the use of color, and particularly the image and creation and honoring of brown skin. As we walk into Ecowomanism in this particular presentation, you may feel yourself embraced by a warmth. I would argue that that warmth is the warmth of spirit. It is the warmth of earth. As we look at the definition on the next slide of Ecowomanism, I invite you to wrestle with and to be challenged by, but also to receive this definition of what Ecowomanism is. An approach to earth justice that centers the theological voices, ethical perspectives, multi-layered analysis, and experiences of women of color, specifically African-American women. It's important to note that in the work of environmental movements throughout the globe, but particularly here in the North American context, that the voices of people of color have not always been included in the bulk or the canon of the environmental studies. So Ecowomanism is unique, but it is also simply a corrective. It is indeed to focus the light again on the fact that peoples of color also have wonderful epistemologies, understandings, theologies, and philosophies, cosmologies, that shape the way they see their relationship with the earth. Ecowomanism as an approach to earth justice really does signal that it is high time that we listen to people of color, particularly those who are involved in the movement as activists, as scholars, as thinkers, as artists, as pastors, as spiritual leaders, and faith keepers, and especially looking at the voices of African American women. You'll note that in the actual word, ecowomanism, it is a combination of a commitment to environmental studies, eco, and also a commitment to womanism, the religious way of thinking or the school of thought across religious and beyond, interdisciplinary kind of conversation that centers in women of color and specifically African American women's understanding of who God is, our relationship to God, the nature of God, and our relationship with one another. Next slide. There are specific 7 methodological steps that we'll look into as we map out what an eco-womanist approach can be and is for the work of environmental justice. The first, as has been mentioned by the panelists ahead of us, is honoring experience. It is true, and I deeply agree. Everyone has a story, and these stories ought to be honored and valued. In fact, even as you're sitting there in the audience or watching online, you might reflect on the fact that you too come to this symposium on this day from a particular story or experience. That there is something in your lifetime that has connected you most soundly to science and religion, and most deeply to the earth. Honoring that story, honoring that experience, is a first step in eco-womanist methodology to engaging in a deeper reflection on how we get to environmental justice. The second step of the method is to indeed reflect on that experience. Just a few examples from eco-womanism is to reflect on the connection you have with Earth. How did you come to know dirt? What connection do you have with trees? Do they sing? And does singing to plants and flowers really help them grow? Considering the cosmologies not just of African indigenous peoples, but also of a number of different indigenous groups, especially here in Native American spaces, there in Philadelphia, and all of the beautiful tribes that were there before settlers, we understand that the earth in that cosmology is considered sacred, not commodity, not object, but that the earth has a sacred connection with humans. Shared experiences of beauty and suffering are another element of what can be understood as we reflect on experiences, particularly when we look at the experiences of people of African descent and African American people. It is the case that as we investigate democracy anew every day, especially now, as we consider all the policies and all of the tensions around bipartisanship that exists even in our policies and even in our politics right now, we cannot ignore the history of enslavement in the United States of America and globally. It is the case that for many African Americans coming to the work of environmental justice, we must wrestle with a component of history that others do not always have to wrestle with. We have been known as earth, as property. And understanding this particular and particularity of African American environmental history, we must reflect on both the beauty of Earth and also the bond with Earth as Earth. Reflecting on these experiences are also a part of the methodological step 2. Step 3 leads us into even deeper analysis, and it's been so beautifully echoed around the gift of intersectionality and intersectional analysis. Conducting womanist social analysis, which is very much akin to intersectional analysis, necessitates that we take seriously the categories of race, class, gender, and a number of other categories when we consider how to create environmental justice in our day. When we think about Flint, Michigan, when we think about any number of cases of environmental racism in our country and also around the world, we must face the fact that racism and classism and sexism are often always present when there is also climate or environmental injustice. Taking on this web, this frame, helps us to deepen our work in creating environmental justice by actually adding this new lens, this form or approach to doing earth care or earth justice. The 4th step on the next slide leads us into critically exploring our own tradition. Now, I must confess that as a Christian, this is one I wrestle with the most. It is a chance to critically consider that all in our tradition has not been healthy for the earth. The dualisms that are present and the hierarchies that are deeply, deeply embedded in Christianity and the way that we think and also the way that we practice are not reflective of how ecosystems work in nature. The logic of domination, which is very, very clear, particularly in ecclesiastical orders where there is power over others, is not necessarily how trees reflect themselves to each other. When we consider critically exploring particularly African American or Black theology or Black religion, we have to dive deep into the traditions of the spirituals, the traditions of slave songs, the traditions of hymns, and even the music of the church. In many ways, the music liberates and frees the soul. But sometimes the music reminds us that there has been a dualism between human life here on earth and heavenly spaces. I am a poor pilgrim of sorrow. I walk in this poor land alone. I have no hope for tomorrow. I want to make heaven my home. In this sacred spiritual, I am a poor pilgrim of sorrow, we hear the deep, deep tones of sorrow that would have accompanied the life of an enslaved African. We also hear, though, a distinction between life of pain and sorrow connected to earth and a deep life of liberation and freedom connected to heaven, as if taking two worlds apart. The spiritual releases an understanding that all life in earth is pain, and all life in heaven is freeing. Now, this is a very different understanding when we consider different theologies from Latina and Black liberation theologians who push us to see heaven on earth. It's also a very different theology to thinking about the theology that's reflected in the mouth of a sunflower. If we can see God in the flower, then bifurcating earth and heaven may not lead us to environmental justice. Engaging transformation is step 5 of the Ecowomanist method, and it really does invite us to signal that our theologies are ever growing, evolving. Even the great Karl Barth and Paul Tillich, Reinhold Niebuhr, King, and many, many others did not believe the same way about God they did towards the end of their journey as they did at the beginning. As a great theologian, it is important to understand your theology can change. Engaging this process of transformation carefully and in healthy modes is important in the 5th step of Ecowomanism. The final 2 steps of the Ecowomanist method, sharing dialogue and taking action for justice, are connected. In fact, 5, 6, and 7 are reflective of a kind of conversation, cyclical often, that happens with one another. Oftentimes it is the case that our own theologies, our own selves, and our lives transform in conversation or dialogue with others. For Ecowomanism, this means not only being in conversation with scientists and theologians from the North American context, but being in conversation with a variety of different scientists across the world, being in touch with theologies that don't always look like ours, and also being open to religious faiths that do not always share the same history that Christianity does. Taking action for justice means indeed the 7th step is engaging and protesting the logic of domination, highlighting the importance of protesting racial ignorance, and recognizing that any fight against white supremacy is also a fight for equality in earth. I invite you, as we look at the next slide, to deepen into some of the work that has already been outlined in the theorizing of Ecowomanism. We begin, of course, with the artist Alice Walker, who is the person, Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Color Purple, and she is the person who coined the term Ecowomanism. Coined the term womanism. In her work, particularly as an activist, an environmental activist, it is the case that her essays really do uncover a deep, deep synergy between Black women's literary thought and literature and activism. Coming to voice as a Black woman meant for her also coming to voice for the earth. And a really powerful essay by Dolores S. Williams, a Paul Tillich scholar and a Paul Tillich professor at Union Theological Seminary, we recognize that there are unique parallels between the experiences of Black enslaved women and experiences of the earth. In this particular essay, she points to the sin of defilement. Anything that is not life-giving is sin, Williams states. Anything that takes away the ability to procreate, such as the practices of sexual assault or trauma, violence, or the repetitive practice of rape, of enslaved African and African American women in the United States of America is not, Dolores says, of God. The same is true of any attempt to violate the earth. In the essay, she makes a very important parallel between the raping of enslaved African women and the raping of mountains through the practice of strip mining, literally exploding the womb of a mountain for the sake of coal, robbing the earth and that mountain of any hope of producing again. It does bring a new question to the reading of any biblical scripture of what does it mean to read, "Be fruitful and multiply," if in fact the logic of domination or the practice of white supremacy, or the understanding that earth is only to be used, robs the mountain or robs earth from being able to reproduce. The work of Bell Hooks, Touching the Earth, in her book, Sisters of the Yam, Black Women in Self-Recovery, becomes another very important piece that helps to create a conceptual map or conceptualization of ecowomanism. Here she asks the question about how important it is and why it is that so many African Americans in this particular day and time are returning back to the South in spaces like North Carolina and spaces like Texas and Louisiana, New Orleans, to go back to a space and a time where things are slower, more in tune with the earth, recognizing the challenge and the major history of the Great Migration, at least in the United States of America, of many African and African American peoples leaving the South by the millions in order to escape Jim and Jane Crow. They went everywhere: Philadelphia, New York, Colorado, California, to build a new life. What Bell Hooks invites us to consider is that the relationship that they had with the earth in the South had to change dramatically sometimes to build a new relationship with the earth in the spaces that they found themselves in. The migration patterns and the idea of placement or displacement matters very deeply to the theorizing of ecowomanism. As we turn to the next slide, I want to invite you to consider some of the other works, of course, that are important pieces in terms of the framing of ecowomanist theory, but also African American environmental history. My own work stands really on the shoulders of those before me. Robert Bullard, many of us know this text as a classic text, of course, in environmental justice. Toxic Communities by Dorsetty E. Taylor, whose work is extraordinary in helping us to look indeed at the importance of uncovering these multi-layered connections around toxicity and environmental injustice, particularly in communities of color. The Environmental Justice, a wonderful co-edited volume, and the work of Florence Margai, very, very important environmental scientist who actually recognizes very early that there is something significant for us to pay attention to in terms of environmental health hazards as they are flowing in particular communities throughout the United States of America and globally, but not in other communities. Here we engage both the work of policy and the work of justice and the work of theology and faith communities, and of course, environmental science. Let me invite you to take a step back now from the theorizing, and let's take a look at the next slide as we continue to move into this work of actually looking at the practice of reflecting on experience. Here we're invited to consider another wonderful piece by Charles White, a wonderful African-American artist. This piece is called I Have a Dream, done in 1978. In this particular era of racial justice, reminds me very deeply about the Madonna image in black skin. There is something significant about a mother's love for a child, a parent's love, and their attempt to cover or protect. In this particular image by Charles White, we may not only just see this black mother, but also a divine parent, caring for. And in a different way, we may see in the curves of the darkness some kind of relationship with Earth. As we go to the next slide, we will recognize that if we use Black eco-literature and Black eco-poetry and art as a base to reflect on our experience, we can see that not only was the myth that environmental movements did not engage people of color truly a myth, but that African American communities in particular have been doing environmental justice for a long, long time. I read to you one example of For a Farmer by James A. Emanuel, a poet. Something slow moves through him, watched by hills. Something flows with him in stubborn streams, and in the parted foliage something lives in upright green, stirred by the rhythmic gleams of his hoe and spade. From worn-out arms he gives, the earth receives, turns all his pain to soil, where he believes and testifies through toil. For a Farmer by James A. Emanuel is one example of extraordinary brilliance in thinking about African American history, and particularly this connection with the earth. We reflect on this particular piece and this particular poem from which to begin to theologize about environmental justice or to think about the science of climate justice. We come with a different base. There is a connection between green and working. There is a connection between the beauty of worn-out brown arms and earth. There is almost a sacred worshipful moment between the earth receiving and transforming the pain of enslavement, the pain of death, the pain of sorrow into soil. When I invite my students to reflect on this piece, many reflect back to me that it feels holy. But there is no mention of God here. So just where does eco-womanist imaginings and reflection take us theologically? It indeed invites us to consider that there is a holy relationship between God, humans, and the earth. Reflective of African cosmology, it invites the entire sacred spiritual realm of ancestors and angels into the process of creating environmental justice. As we turn to step 3 of the Ecowomanist method, we recognize again the gift of womanist social analysis. Many of us may be familiar with basic intersectional analysis, really introduced through feminist and womanist thought. They're really considering race, class, and gender as important components of doing any kind of work around justice, and specifically environmental justice. Here, we are invited to analyze environmental racism, where we see it in our own local area and also where we see it nationally and globally. We use intersectional analysis always, pushing that this form of analysis is crucial if we intend truly on creating environmental justice. To create environmental justice is to create social justice. Any attempt to leave out conversations around anti-racism or how to create inclusive environments for all activists who are committed to the earth, regardless of race or cultural or background, economic background, etc. When we ignore those opportunities, we are actually robbing the earth. These two are justice keepers. These two are earth warriors. Early in the panel, it was a wonderful conversation about eco-sin and social eco-sin. In this particular third step, we're invited to consider the definition of eco-sin, environmental sin, and consider what social eco-sin actually is. In reflecting on one's own personal commitment to the earth, you might reflect on the fact that as an environmentalist, you too have been transformed and changed over the years. That your commitment not only to not littering has actually ended up in a journey of composting, of looking at fossil fuels and your own home use of it, of actually reducing what you can, not only in your own seminary context, but also in your church and faith context. These are steps towards environmental justice. And there may indeed be ways where we repent. Ecowomanism calls for a call for confession of complicit behavior. It calls for repentance. It calls for repair. And it also calls for conversion. We must change. Creating earth justice is imperative for this third step of ecowomanism. Now, I confess, I am not a biblical scholar, but in my tradition of Black Christianity, the biblical Bible is held very, very deeply and very, very deeply valued. So I wrestled with step 4 in that it brought me back to the Bible and the particular biblical hermeneutic that I was raised with. An eco-womanist step 4 methodological approach invites us to look again at how we see and how we read the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And Genesis 1:26, and God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all of the wild animals of the earth." It is the case that we know, particularly those committed to eco-theology and biblical hermeneutics, that the over and the dominion are actually to be understood as stewardship of, relationship to. So why is dominion so popular in our Christian understandings of how we ought to be in connection, in union with the earth? One of my grandmother's favorite psalms was Psalms 90:1-3. Now, if you're like me, oftentimes in your tradition, the grandmother's or the grandfather's favorite scripture ought not be touched. But here I invite you in step 4 to indeed touch the scripture, touch the word. God, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born or brought forth the earth from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. There is so much beautiful imagery in the Psalms and throughout the Bible of a gorgeous, gorgeous earth. In fact, in many ways, we teach children, even today, that one way to know God is to see creation, to experience breath and mountains and air and rivers and oceans. That to understand the love of God is to imagine the ends of one ocean and the touching point to another ocean. Using a different biblical hermeneutic, we are invited indeed to consider that there is something important about theological imagination and the work of doing environmental justice. In the next slide, we have a wonderful invitation to consider also for Black liberation theology, but also for Ecowomanist thought, that the Word, the Bible, is actually not the only route for us to be considering and imagining theologically about what is healthy and healing for the planet and our relationship to it. Here we have the poem, The Creation, by James Weldon Johnson, the same person who wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing the Black National Anthem. When we consider Black Earth and the biblical roots therein, we must consider, too, the history that for many, many people of African descent, at least in the United States of America, but throughout the diaspora, it was illegal to read the Bible. Illegal. This means that the theological imaginations of many, many, many Black Christians and many, many, many of those who practiced a Black Christianity throughout hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years in this space necessitated a deep relationship and knowledge of God. Here we'll find some of the language has been changed for the inclusion of gender inclusivity. And God stepped out on space, and she looked around and said, I'm lonely. I'll make me a world. And as far as the eye of God could see, darkness covered everything. Blacker than 100 midnights down in a cypress swamp. Then God smiled, and the light broke. And the darkness rolled up on one side, and the light stood shining on the other, and God said, that's good. When we consider the epistemologies of African American religious thought, when we consider the real serious framing of Black liberation thought, and invite these into our own imaginings of what we can consider as we dream out loud a theology that is healthy for environmental justice, we come back to a different kind of root, a different understanding, a relational connection between the people, between God, and between the planet. It is in the work of Peter Paris and many others that there is woven a deep understanding of an ethical mandate to care for community, to care for all, and indeed, I believe, to care for the earth that is woven into all peoples of African descent, in part because the inheritance of an ethical mandate across all African religiosities necessitates some kind of connection to the divine and an honoring of all that the divine has created, including the self, the Black body, the Black soul, the Black mind. In an age of Black Lives Matters, we find that Ecowomanism also echoes that not just Black beings, all beings, non-human, matter. The emphasis on Black Lives Matters indeed is echoed in part because for so long, Black lives have not mattered. Remembering history is a key component of doing the work of step 4. It invites us to consider that eco-memory, remembering indeed, is crucial. Eco-memory refers to the collective and individual memory of the earth that African Americans have in relationship to and with the earth. African cosmology, as I've explained, and the gift of interconnectedness. Looking again at agricultural epistemologies, knowledge of the soil, knowledge of earth. Not only do we see this in the history of slavery, medicinal and conjure roots, as in the narrative of Frederick Douglass, but also in the stories of the Underground Railroad and Harriet Tubman. Josetta E. Taylor reminds us that Harriet Tubman indeed was an environmentalist and a scientist, not just the Moses of her time. Considering also step 4 allows us to recognize the burden to beauty paradox, a wonderful phrase and coined by Kimberly E. Ruffin that helps us to put into conversation this paradox between the suffering and also the beauty shared with the earth. Another poem by Arna Botemps. I have sown beside waters in my day. I planted deep within my heart the fear that wind or fowl would take the grain away. I planted safe against this stark, lean year. I scattered seed enough to plant the land in rows from Canada to Mexico, but for my reaping, only what the hand can hold at once is all that I can show. Yet when I sowed and what the orchards yields, my brother's sons are gathering stalk and root. Small wonder then my children glean in fields they have not sown and feed on bitter fruit. For those of us familiar indeed with the history of racism in the United States of America, we know that bitter fruit is a symbol, a word that explains and points us to the history of lynching. In the next slide, we see an image of one of the most important figures in helping to uncover the reality of lynching, the artist Billie Holiday, in her song, Strange Fruit. I invite the audience now to receive a bit of a trigger warning. Some of the images moving forward may be violent and difficult to ingest. I invite you, at any point, to simply close your eyes and I will cue you when you can open them again, or if it's helpful to actually step out of the presentation at this time. When we consider eco-memory in the depths of what it means to uncover the environmental history, particularly of African Americans in the United States of America, we must consider that lynching is a part of that history. Here we see the lynching of an African American male in 1960 in Georgia. The next slide, we see a different scene of lynching. This by the artist Joseph Holster, called Property Loss. Here I invite students to consider that we have different relationships to earth, even in this image. Not only do we see the shameful heads of those who lynched the Black man, but we see the sun in the background setting. What must the earth think of lynching? How does the earth feel about the dying Black body? One of the challenges of Ecowomanism is that it invites us to wrestle with our own eco story, but also the eco story of our country and our world. How might we repair the relationship between the descendants of those who lynched the Black man and the descendants of those whose parent, grandparent, great-great-grandparent was lynched, and the tree the lynching tree. The tree becomes complicit in an act of racial violence. How might we repair the relationship between Black peoples and the tree, the lynching tree, and also repair the relationship between the lynchers who used the tree to kill a being? These questions in step 4 are a part of the work of uncovering that we find by using an eco-womanist lens. Let me invite us to move forward into other steps as we head into the eco-womanist methodology, reflecting again on other eco-memories. We consider the Great Migration, and here a very famous piece, Jacob Lawrence, The Migration Series. The next slide, another image of memories and thinking about how memory and eco-memory is very important as we go into the final movement of an eco-womanist method. Step 5, engaging transformation and actually moving towards justice. This is a beautiful piece called After Harriet by Joseph Holston. And here we do see the earth, the sun, the movement of earth right behind these particular figures moving through the Underground Railroad in a significant way, as if that earth has always been a partner to Black people. And for eco-womanism, it has. As we move forward in the slide presentations, we recognize that it is not only in the transformation of recognizing the deep connection between earth and peoples, but also the gift of sharing dialogue. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation here, we do understand that the transformation of one's theology, just in one's living and one's life, can happen not just by divine experience, but also the divine experience of being in conversation with others, hearing the joy of someone else's earth story, reflecting on how different or how similar their earth story is to yours. And for eco-womanism, recognizing that all peoples of African descent across the globe do not practice one religion. While Christianity clearly is global, it is the case that not every human being on the planet is Christian. How might we work with other faiths in healing and dealing with climate change? Step 6 moves into step 7 and actually taking some serious action, recognizing that all of those who have worked so hard before us, including Alice Walker and Katie Cannon and Dolores Williams and Tracy Hucks, are also moving us towards being able to work almost multivocally, in the words of Dolores Williams, being able to speak to each other on multiple levels, but also to be able to translate with each other to the glory and the gift of creation. We'll finish up towards the end of the presentation in order to create a space for some Q&A by recognizing again the gift of working for Earth justice together, facing the rising sun, another wonderful piece by Joseph Holston, this one from the collection Color in Freedom. Even artists, and especially artists, scientists, and theologians are connected deeply to the images of earth. As we consider the new theological imagination required in order to meet the challenge of climate change, in order to do the work of environmental justice, I invite you to reflect again on image and art, on poetry and story, and especially your own earth story. Thank you very much for the gift and honor of being with you today. I invite these questions or other questions that you may have.
Before we do any Q&A, I want to personally thank you for what was both a keynote address and a time of worship and contemplation. Thank you for that gift. And I would invite... I would invite anyone here who has any questions to approach the microphone over here or type it up in Zoom on the Q&A section or in the chat section. I know no one ever wants to be the very first person. There we go.
Hi, my name is Angelo Soto, and first off I want to thank you very much for coming and speaking to us, especially about some dire issues in our country and in our society, in our nation, that everyone, especially African Americans, I think, have dealt with, and in terms of just like issues that many Black people, especially going back to the slavery days and stuff and all this, to the civil rights issues and all that. Especially for me as a African American male, I guess how do I navigate a society that is one, I have very different views than people, specifically more conservative views and stuff and all that. Except I have people who look like me saying that I'm wrong and stuff and all that. I guess how would I navigate through that, especially in a society that is creating like division and issues within our society, I guess, rather.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your courage and the question. I certainly appreciate it. You know, there are lots of different answers to that question, and I think in a deep way, God gives each one of us a number of different angels along the way. I invite you to consider the angels indeed that have been gifted to you even in that space. A short answer to your question is to know your theology, to know who you are, and to know whose you are, and to know what you believe, and to know it in the way that James Cone and other Black liberation theologies were to know it, which means to really enjoy and deepen in the gift of study. This is not to say that you won't need to also read Barth and Tillich and Niebuhr and everyone else. But in reading other theologians, you often find your own voice, what you agree with and what you disagree with, in part because of your own social location and who you are. In mapping out a path of survival and also thriving as an African American male in the society, I do believe that it means leaning back into the wisdom that you've been gifted from your own people. This means reading Howard Thurman and reading Martin Luther King again, and remembering some of the great preaching and preaching voices that have emerged through social media during the pandemic. These voices didn't exist 2 years ago. To recognize that many times I think the prayer of survival is heard by God, by Black people, and to consider earth prayers and Black prayer as one. It's a big question, and I think that one answer is to keep living, to not give up on life, because it is the case that the levels of despair in our country around racial injustice have gotten us all to the point where we have wanted to give up. I say, do not give up. Do not give up. Find hope in your heart. It is there.
One of the things I hear you saying, and that has been echoed a couple of times so far today, is this falling back in love with God by falling back in love with the earth, and a return to a certain ancient spirituality that understood that before we forgot in the name of progress or whatever. And I truly appreciate the work that you have done in helping encourage people to discover their own stories. And if you have not already read Ecowomanism in one of your theology classes, you should purchase it right now. But I wonder if you could just take a minute here as we are closing out our session and maybe help us to, those of us who have found that love, that fallen back in love with God's good earth, and found the divine in it, how can we show that to others? How can we help them to develop their own stories and fall back in love with the earth?
Great question. Thank you, Dr. Jackson. You know, as a teacher of theology and certainly theological ethics, I often invite my students into contemplative practice of some kind. And here is actually where science is really helpful to us, those of us who teach as faculty and certainly work as staff, especially in seminary context. There is something significant about neurological science and what we have found in literally the capacity to invite people to breathe deeply. And there's something very important about the fact that for eons, you know, Christian theologians and ancient Christian mystics, and also Buddhist mystics, and also Islamic mystics, and have leaned into breath, ruach, as a way of centering the soul and centering the mind. That scientists, you know, now are working so much more deeply with those who teach meditation is significant, I think, in part because the levels of anxiety on our planet are so much higher than they used to be. Our planet is not only getting hotter because of climate change, but I think that there's an energy, too, that is making people grow on edge. You can pray a million prayers to calm the soul, and the prayer of a breath is also very deeply helpful. So this is not the disciples' prayer. This is actually teaching students and teaching people to breathe. To breathe. It is an invitation for those of us who do the work in contemplative practice and care to help us to return back to the basics, and then also to do some work on what does it mean to have fresh and clean air, to be able to breathe. One of the important, examples I use in the book is the echo of Eric Gardner being strangled, right? In a sense, it was the fact that he did not have the right to life because of the acts of some police officers, white in their racial orientation, but also because he had asthma, and that the quality of air in Staten Island is poor. When air works alongside racial violence, then we do have a situation whereby it's not just a justice legal issue or a corrective measure that needs to be done. It is an examination of what we are doing as humans to the planet, whereby we, for those who are most vulnerable, can perish mostly from it. So in this sense, Ecowomanism itself is an echo back to Eric Gardner, I Can't Breathe, to teach people to breathe. And in so doing, I think we teach people to recognize the value of the breath of others. not just their skin color, not just who they are in the complexity of human identity, but also to recognize the breath of water and the breath that flowers need and the breath that species needs. So in answering your question, I must say that a return to the contemplative or reflective is actually really helpful for me as a teacher to pass on to people, to deepen. I say too that, one of the gifts I have in being connected to so many different artists is to, as a scholar, to refrain from always using words, but to lean into art and color and being out in nature. I think for many of us as teachers, COVID pandemic forced us outside of the classroom. It forced us to take classes outside. It forced us, to be able to teach outside. And just like little children, seminary students and graduate students also could get distracted by a glorious, flock of whatever bird flying in the sky, even as you're lecturing on the most important theological concept. That too, I think, is an invitation for teachers to recognize that words are not always the only teachers, that context matters, and allowing people to be in earth, to worship outside, to touch trees, to hear from water. These are important ways of actually helping people to deepen their connection with the earth.
All right. Well, I want to once again thank you so very much for joining us, for taking of your time to be with us. We, of course, wish that you could have been with us in person. I know the feeling is mutual, but these are strange times, and so we rejoice in what technology has brought us. There are definitely positives to it, and thank you for the reminder to breathe. And, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.